In this episode of American Greed.
I didn't know his real name. I didn't know his real age. I didn't know whether or not anything that I had learned about him or thought I knew was in any way true.
The perfect husband turns out to be an imposter.
And if he wasn't Dr. Gerald Barnes, who was he?
And later, a businessman with a secret.
He was leading these dual lives.
Life built on lies and deception.
He had absolutely no conscience.
Taking from those who know him and those who don't. A serial bank robber, in his own words.
No big money, no alarms, be calm and no one gets hurt.
Okay, hold on, sweetie. We're going to get an x-ray, all right? Be right there.
In 1979, Rick D'Alessandro works as a physician's assistant to Dr. Gerald Barnes, the director of a medical facility in Orange County, California.
He was a very likable little guy. Funny and entertaining and easy to talk to, engaging guy.
On the morning of December 26th, 29-year-old John McKenzie shows up for a visit with Dr. Barnes.
He was losing weight, and he was tired and, thirsty, and, he just didn't look good.
McKenzie has been feeling sick for several days.
He had presented to Dr. Barnes with some dizziness, excessive thirst, excessive urination, dry mouth, problems with equilibrium and balance.
Dr. Barnes gives the patient a prescription for an anti-vertigo drug and sends him home, while routine blood tests are sent to the lab. The next day, McKenzie's blood results come back, but Dr. Barnes has the day off.
They brought me the chart when the results came back on Mr. McKenzie, showing that he had a 1,200 blood sugar. And normal blood sugar is like 100, 80 to 100, and he had a 1,200.
To D'Alessandro, the patient is showing classic symptoms of an acute diabetic crisis, and John McKenzie's life could be in imminent danger. D'Alessandro tries desperately to reach the patient.
Nobody had heard from him nor seen him. His emergency contact numbers, his ex-wife, and someone else that was on there had not heard from him or seen him. So I decided to call the police.
Officers from the Garden Grove Police Department head to McKenzie's address and break the door in.
I found him dead in his kitchen, laying on the floor with Dr. Barnes' prescription for the dizziness drug in his hand. And he had collapsed and went into a coma and died.
The 29-year-old is dead from uncontrolled diabetes.
He should have been hospitalized or, right there. Something should have been done. But they sent him home.
While McKenzie's family struggles with the senseless loss, Rick D'Alessandro wants answers. How could any doctor miss such a common and easily diagnosed condition? The physician's assistant decides to do some checking.
So calling the medical board up in Sacramento and having them fax down a picture and identification and information regarding Gerald Barnes. Well, the picture that comes down doesn't look anything like Barnes. And the home address is like a street in Stockton.
Stockton is 400 miles from the Orange County Clinic. And for Rick D'Alessandro, the proof is shocking. He has been working with a fraud.
This is a huge, huge issue. This guy had been there for a few years, had been elevated to a medical director, and was seeing patients by the tune of like 30 or 40 every single day for years now.
D'Alessandro reports his findings to the police, and on August 8, 1980, the phony doctor is arrested for murder.
Barnes begins working at that Pacific Southwest Medical Group in '78.
Orange County Deputy DA James Enright and investigator Eddie Banks are tasked with building a case against the imposter.
Well, we knew right away we could get him on practicing medicine without a license. The big thing was to get him on the manslaughter, because the practicing medicine without a license didn't have much teeth in it at all at that time.
Their investigation reveals that the suspect is not really Gerald Barnes, but a man named Gerald Barnbaum, a pharmacist from Chicago, who got caught up in a Medicaid scam 5 years earlier. Though acquitted by a jury, Barnbaum's pharmacy license was revoked, and he decided to start over in California.
He did background checks, so the guy found out the guy was an actor.
Barnbaum has been a college thespian and was heavily involved in community theater. Upon landing in Orange County in 1977, he created his own starring role as a doctor, even though he had no medical training.
He called the medical board and asked the medical board for a duplicate copy of his license, saying that he was Gerald Barnes, a physician in Stockton. The medical board then sent him a copy because he said he was opening up a clinic in Los Angeles, sent him a copy of the license without doing any other verification other than that.
Now, the Orange County District Attorney's Office hopes to stop him cold.
Never mind, he wasn't a doctor. There was a connection between what he should have done, what he didn't do, and the death of Mackenzie. Ultimately, that's where we got to.
On May 29, 1981, the con man pleads guilty in a plea bargain to the charges of manslaughter and practicing medicine without a license. He is sentenced to 3 years in prison. For the family of John Mackenzie, the sentence does not seem to fit the crime, and the victim's 4-year-old daughter, Jill, is left without a father.
He was a nice young man with a lot of life ahead of him. And he could have been, who knows what he could have been. And that's what's so sad, is that he and Jill had that taken away.
And there is another victim still, the man whose good name was tainted by the imposter.
My wife tells me she was driving to a nearby town and she heard on the radio that Dr. Gerald Barnes had been arrested and found guilty of manslaughter.
The real Dr. Gerald Barnes is a well-respected orthopedic surgeon from Northern California. He had no idea that his identity had been stolen.
Well, first I was in shock. I didn't know that someone, how could someone do something like this? Then the more I thought about the matter I got, and but I was satisfied after I found out that he was incarcerated, and this was going to be the end of the problem.
The problem, however, is only beginning. After 18 months, the imposter doctor is released on good behavior and picks up right where he left off, as Dr. Gerald Barnes. Until one day, when Dr. Barnes comes face to face with the man who blew the whistle on his charade.
He looks at me and he says, "Hi, Rick, how you doing?" And I said, "Well, Gerald, I'm not doing too well because you're doing the same thing that you did back in the 70s. And he said, "Well, this is all just a big mistake."
In 1996, life is good for Lisa Roberts and her husband, Dr. Gerald Barnes. The couple has been married just over a year.
It was very romantic, and along with the courtship, there were, flowers and evenings out for dinner or to events and concerts. Charmed the girl right off her feet.
While Dr. Barnes earns a 6-figure salary as medical director at a Los Angeles clinic, Lisa makes plans for their future together.
My expectations were that we would have children, and at some point we would be able to save enough money to start his own practice.
The doctor and his wife seem to have everything going for them, until one day when Dr. Barnes runs into an old acquaintance at an industry Christmas party.
And I'm looking to see what's on his lapel, because when you check into the Christmas party, they gave you a little sticky tag that says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so," And his said, "Hi, I'm Dr. Barnes."
Rick D'Alessandro worked as a physician's assistant to the same Dr. Barnes 16 years ago. Problem is, Gerald Barnes is not really a doctor. He's an imposter who, in 1979, was responsible for his patient's death. John Mackenzie was 29 years old.
I wanted him off the street because this guy hurts people and, in fact, kills people.
The next day, D'Alessandro drives to Los Angeles and a meeting with Dr. Barnes' supervisors at the clinic.
Said, "Are you aware that this guy Gerald Barnes is a fraud? He's not really a doctor."
While they're talking, Gerald Barnes happens in.
He looks at me and he says, "Hi, Rick, how you doing?" And I said, "Well, Gerald, I'm not doing too well because you're doing the same thing that you did back in the 70s. And he said, "Well, this is all just a big mistake." I can go home and get all the information I need to. And they said, well, this is a pretty serious thing, so we do need you to do that. So we need you to go home and get it. Well, he disappeared. They never saw him again.
D'Alessandro reports Barnes to the California Medical Board, who in turn takes it to the FBI. Agent Marie Konjalski learns that her suspect's given name is Gerald Barnbaum, and he has been using the stolen identity of the real Dr. Gerald Barnes for over 2 decades.
He had been convicted 3 times in the 80s for various state violations involving his portrayal of the real physician.
Since 1981, the imposter has been in and out of prison, serving a total of 5 years. While behind bars, he took medical correspondence courses, and each time he stepped out of the prison gates, he stepped into his lab coat and resumed his life as a doctor. Incredibly, the imposter has been hired over and over again by at least 6 medical companies in Southern California. Konjalski also learns that more than 100 of the FBI's own agents are patients of the phony doctor.
The FBI had a contract with that particular clinic to perform both employment physicals for FBI agents as well as pre-employment exams that are required as part of the application process.
When the so-called Dr. Gerald Barnes is taken into custody, his wife, Lisa Roberts, is left in shock.
I didn't know his real name. I didn't know his real age. I didn't know whether or not anything that I had learned about him or thought I knew was in any way true. And if he wasn't Dr. Gerald Barnes, who was he? And who had I let share my life and my bed and my family, and who had I trusted?
Roberts says she couldn't have imagined that her husband wasn't really a doctor.
Here I am. I'm married to a man who I believe to be a physician. Every day he goes out and he acts as a physician. He wears the physician's coat. He works with patients. Other doctors think he's a doctor. Patients think he's a doctor. The FBI thought he was a doctor. So who am I to not think he was a doctor?
On October 10, 1996, Gerald Barnes, a.k.a. Gerald Barnbaum, stands before a federal judge to face 6 charges of fraud.
Today, the 62-year-old appeared weak and had difficulty walking. He claims to suffer from diabetes and prostate cancer.
Barnbaum pleads guilty in another plea bargain and is sentenced to 12.5 years in a federal prison. The real Dr. Barnes is there to see his imposter put away.
He was crying about the fact that he was sick and he wouldn't be able to see his grandchildren and so forth and so on. And that's when the judge said, I'm convinced that if I were to let you free, set you free, that you would, 100% chance that you would do this again.
He was driven to do this, as evidenced by the fact that he wasn't afraid to go back to prison. He'd get out of prison, and almost immediately he would start practicing medicine again.
He collects money, he treats people, he hurts people, and the same thing happens. He's arrested again, and you see the headline. You never know what happens after that. And for the most part, it goes away.
Investigators hope this prison stretch will finally put an end to Barnbaum's counterfeit career. But this 63-year-old con man seems to have a way of hoodwinking nearly everyone he meets.
I received word from one of my colleagues here at the FBI, and then soon thereafter got a call from the U.S. Marshals Service, who'd been notified by Bureau of Prisons of his escape.
I had to prove that I was the good guy and he was the bad guy. So
Dr. Gerald Barnes is an orthopedic surgeon. He's been practicing in Stockton, California for 37 years.
It almost gets to the point that you become calloused over this because it happens so often.
For more than 2 decades, Dr. Barnes has been shadowed by an imposter, a man who stole his medical license, his credentials, and his good name.
Then we got into all the problems with the stealing of my identity as far as opening accounts and buying 2 cars and my driver's license, which I've had to change over the years and so forth. So it's been a real headache.
In 1996, the identity thief, whose real name is Gerald Barnbaum, receives his longest prison sentence to date, 12 and a half years in the federal pen. And the case of the phony doctor should finally be brought to a close. But 4 years later, Barnbaum is transferred to another prison, and once again, he pops up on the radar of the FBI.
I learned that given that he had been categorized as a low-security inmate, that in transferring Mr. Barnbaum from one facility in California to another facility in another state, that he was given a bus ticket and allowed to travel on his own.
Barnbaum is supposed to report to a prison in Illinois, but he never shows up. After a month of searching, U.S. Marshal Joseph Exner locates the fugitive at a North Hollywood clinic.
Myself, my partner in LAPD went inside the clinic. I called out for Gerald Barnbaum. He stepped out wearing a white coat, a stethoscope. He simply said, "You guys are good." And then I turned him around, patted him down, and put cuffs on him.
In May of 2004, Gerald Barnbaum pleads guilty to 3 additional counts of fraud and identity theft. A federal judge adds another 10 years to the imposter's 12-and-a-half-year sentence.
He had used the same false identity documents to portray himself as the real Dr. Gerald Barnes, got a job at this clinic, and was seeing a number of patients a day and once again prescribing controlled substances in violation of federal law.
Barnbaum collected an estimated $100,000 a year during his counterfeit career and bilked insurance companies and individuals out of more than $5 million in fraudulent patient claims. The last company that hired the imposter, Executive Health Group, was perhaps hit the hardest.
The last clinic at which he was employed here in Los Angeles had billed somewhere in the neighborhood of about $350,000 to their clients for services that had been provided by Mr. Barnbaum.
In addition to repaying much of the fraudulent billing, Executive Health Group was slapped with a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit brought on by nearly 500 former patients, including Carl Jansen, an executive with Atlantic Richfield Corporation.
I was on their executive payroll, and one of our benefits was an annual, they called it executive medical exam.
Jansen had received a full workup by Dr. Barnes in 1996.
We went through the routine medical exam, included all the questions, the blood work, checking your vitals, all of those kinds of things. He was very personable, appeared to be very professional about what he was doing. Part of the exam was a prostate exam, and he seemed to be very professional about all of that.
Jansen had no idea anything was amiss until the next day, when he saw his doctor on the evening news.
Out came the good Dr. Barnes in handcuffs out of Executive Health, and I went, whoa, what in the world is going on?
Today, Gerald Barnes, seen here in 1981, was arraigned in federal court on charges of practicing medicine without a license.
The businessman soon found out that he had been duped by an imposter.
I went into Executive Health fully trusting that they had a competent professional staff. I had no reason to think otherwise. I'm sure it was as big a surprise to them as it was to me. Now, you could argue that it's understandable that it was a surprise to me, and it shouldn't have been a surprise to them.
Diane Goldman represents Jansen and other plaintiffs in the civil suit. She believes that healthcare companies need to be held responsible for the people they hire.
They definitely need to be more diligent. The evidence that was developed in the lawsuit showed that the background information or background investigation that was supposed to be performed on this imposter doctor wasn't done. And had they done the bare minimum, they would have discovered his numerous felony convictions and the problems surrounding him.
While Executive Health Group denies liability in the case, the lawsuit was settled for just over $9 million, and the company is now out of business.
Money. Follow the money. It's always about money.
For Lisa Roberts, who was once married to Gerald Barnbaum and now refers to her phony husband as the never was. The ability for the con man to perpetrate his fraud over and over again comes down to one thing: greed.
It's always about money. It was about money for the never was. It was about money for his companies. It was about money for the people who he worked for before that apparently knew that there was something wrong and had fired him for a variety of reasons, but said nothing to anyone.
Gerald Birnbaum is now 74 years old. He is serving his sentence at Waseca Federal Prison in Minnesota. His projected release date is in 2018.
He's a very dangerous human being. His age won't make any difference. Now he can be a almost semi-retired physician, and no doubt when he walks through those doors, he will be a physician again.
Next, on American Greed, he hit 43 banks in 6 states.
There was a demand note indicating, I have a gun, be quiet.
A serial bandit who can't be stopped.
They've done it this many times. Why would they stop?
Eluding capture for nearly 2 years, and now the hunt is on. Louisville, Kentucky, the River City, gateway to the South. On November 11, 2002, the city falls prey to a bank robber who targets banks inside of grocery stores. He adds Louisville to an ever-growing list of cities he's targeting. His weapons, a simple disguise and a threatening note. His take today, $6,000. Louisville Metro Detective Larry Duncan draws the case. Duncan's been chasing robbers for the past 11 years.
There was a demand note indicating this is a holdup. I have a gun. Be calm. Both drawers. Be quiet. Go home alive.
The note is clean. No fingerprints. The robber is a white male who appears to be in his early to mid-40s. The teller describes him as wearing a mustache and a fishing hat. Larry Duncan believes this bandit has hit before. Over the past 5 months, there have been 4 similar bank holdups in the Louisville metro area, including one 2 weeks earlier, just across the border in Indiana.
The clothing worn during the Jeffersonville, Indiana robbery consisted of a pair of tan coveralls, a fishing-style hat or boonie hat, as did the robbery at the Winn-Dixie on November 11th. So what it did for me clearly was indicate this was the same person that was responsible for now at least 5 bank robberies.
Hey, 70, I'm going to be out for about 20 minutes.
115 miles northeast in Blue Ash, Ohio, Detective Joe Schlee is investigating a grocery store bank robbery of his own. Schlee notices a teletype fax from Detective Duncan about a series of similar bank robberies in Louisville, Kentucky.
I did not know Larry Duncan prior to this case. He sent me a photo matrix of some bank video shots that he had received. And we showed that matrix to our teller, and she was definite that it was the same guy that hit her.
Detective Duncan suspects the Blue Ash robber could be the same man linked to 17 other grocery store robberies in 4 states. Duncan is searching the internet for banks and markets near interstates when a thought crosses his mind about the bandit's sophisticated methods.
I think the guy I'm looking for is doing the exact same thing I'm doing. You could almost visualize the two of us doing the same thing with those computers, me in an attempt to locate where he was going to go next, and him in an attempt to decide where he was going to go next.
Larry Duncan examines a map in his office and sees a pattern unfolding before him.
When you look at the relationship between Indianapolis, Indiana, Louisville, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, Ohio, and the major interstates that are intersecting those 3 highways, and then run a parallel with that to the bank marks that he's hitting, you really had no other alternative other than to name him the Interstate Bank Mark Bandit.
The Interstate Bank Mark Bandit, or IBM for short, lands squarely on the FBI's radar.
My initial contact with the IBM Bandit case was a robbery that I had here in Cincinnati, Ohio.
We've hidden the agent's face at the FBI's request.
When I came back from that robbery and I started having conversations with a Detective Joe Schlee, I found that he not only had his bank robbery in Blue Ash, but also was working on other bank robberies here in Cincinnati, trying to link them, as well as bank robberies down in Louisville and Lexington.
Duncan, Schlee, and Freihofer team up to form the IBM Task Force. They suspect the bandit of at least 20 robberies, but are no closer to identifying them. Just before sunset on a Friday night, the task force catches an unexpected break.
In June of 2003, a bank robbery occurred inside a Meijer in Lexington, Kentucky.
It's IBM's 29th robbery. A surveillance camera at the Meijer grocery store captures this photo of IBM's getaway.
You're actually able to see the IBM bandit entering the back seat of the getaway vehicle. And clearly, you're able to determine that it is a black, late 90s model, four-door BMW IL, I believe.
Police learn something else from the images. IBM has an accomplice.
In some of his demand notes, he would make reference that we are listening and we have a scanner. A lot of times that is a trick, but we had evidence suggesting that this was correct. And we were getting evidence that there was a white female sitting in a car outside that he was getting in.
The task force develops a theory about the robber's home base.
I think he started in Indianapolis. He got some exposure, and he didn't like it, so he said, I'm gonna go further away.
And we could almost feel that we could travel with the IBM bandit down the expressways that he was using as he was hitting each one of these, and then turning around again and heading back into what we assumed was his safe zone in Indiana.
Detective Duncan uses that theory to formulate a plan to catch IBM. He calls it Operation Intercept. Cops will monitor the interstates, hoping to capture IBM as he heads back home to Indiana. Duncan selects 5 banks in the Louisville metro area that fit the bandit's M.O.
We would put undercover cars and undercover detectives as tellers inside these banks so that when he hit, we would be right on top of him.
Officers would then use police radios to coordinate IBM's capture.
So the idea was to calmly state Operation Intercept and then set up and start pulling over all the black four-door BMWs that were heading north toward Indianapolis.
The city of Louisville puts its full force, about 1,200 officers, on operational alert. On September 6, 2003, with the trap set and baited, IBM robs a U.S. bank in Louisville just as the task force predicted. It's hit number 35.
The sergeant that got on the radio almost shouted Operation Intercept. It wasn't quiet and discreet by any means. I'm kind of shaking my head and thinking to myself, Duncan, you're blowing it. I know I'm blowing it. Because I felt without question that the Interstate Bank Mark bandit was listening to every word over that radio and that it was slipping away from me.
The bandit avoids the interstates and slips through the noose. 1 week passes without even a fleeting glimpse of IBM or the black BMW.
And finally, I called the commander of the operation and I say, look, we've blown it. He's not hitting. And he said, are you asking me to call it off? And I was like, yeah, I'm asking to call it off. We've missed our chance. He's gone.
When we come back, Larry Duncan is left to wonder if and when he'll get another shot at the IBM bandit. For more information and special web exclusives, log on to americangreed.cnbc.com. "16 months and 35 banks into the crime spree, IBM is still on the loose. His take so far, $136,000. And only 2 people know his true identity. One is the blonde female who drives the getaway car. The other is a 46-year-old self-proclaimed entrepreneur with a shady past named David Branco. David Branco is the IBM bandit.
The first time I met David, he was impeccably dressed.
Phil Sperry runs a title company out of Bloomington, Indiana. He and his late wife, Bonnie, crossed paths with David Branco in 1999.
He always seemed to have the right response to any question. He was cool. He was very smooth.
Branco rents a small office in a building they own.
And this is the space that we rented to David Brankel. It was to be his headquarters where he was going to operate all of his business and his dealing with architecture and construction. And his company was called ACR. Now, I know the A was for architecture, and I know the C was for construction, and now I understand the R is for robbery.
David Brankel approaches Bonnie with a proposition that they create an interior design firm named Trade Secrets.
I think he saw her as a meal ticket. I think he thought that she was the kind of person who perhaps could be peeled off and attended to individually so that he would get access to the great fortune, whatever that is.
Brankel uses the Sperry name to reach into the pockets of other Bloomington businesses.
Oh, yeah, just like old times.
Sullivan's clothing store is a Bloomington institution.
David went in and ran up a bill, I think it was about $1,700, and paid it off, no problem, and then said to Bobby, well, could I perhaps have a house account? And so Bobby said, sure. And at which point, I believe he ran up a little over $8,000 worth because he was a dapper dresser. And then that's when he didn't pay.
As time goes on, David Brankel begins to wear out his welcome in Bloomington. Phil and Bonnie Sperry cut him off, both personally and professionally.
I very much regret the damage done to our friends, and I really feel responsible for having caused that to happen, and I very much regret that.
Brankel skips town with his wife and young son and drives southwest, landing in Vincennes, Indiana. There, he finds his next mark. Alan Logan is well known in Vincennes. He and his wife Becky own one of the town's favorite family businesses, Logan's Wet Pets and more.
There you go. Thanks much.
The Logans are looking to expand their pet store concept into a family entertainment complex they call Logan's Great Escape.
We met David. Our first impression was legitimate businessman. We needed our developer, and here he was. We actually, Becky and I thought, we were going home that night talking, we said maybe this was God's gift to us.
Brankel sells himself as a consultant with the Vanguard Capital Marketing Group and says he is based in Chicago.
He had Vanguard Capital Marketing material spread out on the table, nice display of all their jobs they completed, and the contract on how much it was going to cost to hire them, and timetables and all that, and it looked legit.
But it isn't. Brankel tells them he needs a retainer of $3,500 to start, as well as $500 per month over the course of the project. Then Brankel turns to an old con man's ploy.
He was getting ready to go out of town on another project, and he needed to know ASAP. And the following morning, I come down here bright and early and wrote a big check for him.
The beginning of each month, David Brankel comes to collect his check, sometimes with his son at his side.
And a lot of times he'd bring Michael in, and Michael would have the bill in his hand and give it to me. Sad.
To everyone around him, David Brankel is the epitome of a successful businessman. But he's living multiple lives. Sunday through Wednesday, Brankel lives in this rented house in Vincennes with his wife and son. Thursday through Saturday, he travels back to Bloomington to a girlfriend named Donna Hewins and his life as a serial bank robber.
He said that they were watching a movie about a bank robber. He said, what would you think of me if I told you this is what I do for a living? And she reportedly said, I would still love you.
Andrew Wolfson is a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal.
And then gradually she became increasingly involved. She would start driving the getaway car. She would join him on encasing the banks.
Donna met David at a topless bar in Bloomington where she worked as a waitress. They dated, grew close, and Donna became Bonnie to David Brankel's Clyde.
By the time I met him, he was a very self-pitying character who blamed everything on everyone else, including and mostly his mother. He was hoping he could become the most successful bank robber of all time because his mother had always said he couldn't mow the lawn right.
David Brankel, it turns out, is very good at one thing in his life, taking advantage of everyone and everything around him.
I would not only say he was a narcissist, I would say he's a sociopath in the sense that he had absolutely no conscience.
You could ask anybody in this town that shops with me. I'd give you my shirt off my back if I could help you out. And they'll tell you I would. But I couldn't do that now. And that hurts.
David Brankel's success as the IBM bandit has been a perfect mix of luck, skill, and planning. But as 2003 draws to a close, one mistake is about to change everything.
If he was going to come up with a gun, I wanted to have mine out first.
December of 2003. In the nearly 4 months since the IBM bandit escaped Operation Intercept, David Brankel and Donna Hewins have been very busy, committing another 8 robberies, bringing the total to 43. And 4 more months of payments have cost the Logans an additional $2,000. On December 29th, David Brankel is visiting Bloomington once again, and his luck changes. On Highway 45, Brankel nearly strikes a vehicle driven by Bloomington police detective Kevin Hill.
I noticed in my rearview mirror a black BMW coming at a high rate of speed, and he basically cut myself and the other vehicle off, sending us into oncoming traffic, almost causing an accident, and he lost control of his vehicle, and that's where I pulled him over about a quarter mile down the road.
Detective Hill calls in the driver's information.
Well, the driver's license wasn't coming back, but the plate came back stolen.
Hill moves in to remove the driver from the car.
I asked for him to show me his hands, and he gave me his left hand, but he wouldn't give me the right one. He had it down below his right leg. And so I kept telling him to bring his hand up, and he wouldn't do it. So I pulled my gun out and pointed it at him and told me to let me see his hands, and they better come up empty. And he looked up at me, and he said, "We're okay." And he dropped the car and drive, and he took off.
The pursuit reaches speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour.
He's running people off the road. He's disregarding stop signs, driving right through intersections.
The BMW sedan leaves Detective Hill's Ford Taurus in the dust. David Brankel escapes the police yet again. But this time, he leaves a vital clue in their hands, an Indiana driver's license. Just across the Wabash River from Illinois sits Vincennes, Indiana. Vincennes is Indiana's first city. It is about to become David Brankel's last.
This is the house at 1919 Hickory that David Brankel lived at when the state police were looking for the stolen plate. Trooper Trotter arrived and saw the garage door was open and saw the vehicle and the plate. Shortly after that, David Brankel came out and got in his car.
Brankel leads the Indiana State Police on a chase through the streets of Vincennes.
As I was listening to the pursuit, and I was coming down College, and I heard John Trotter say that he was out on foot. Brankel had abandoned his child in the car, and so Trooper Trotter was staying with the child at that time with the car.
Brankel runs, trying to lose Sergeant Winkler in the maze of apartment buildings.
As he was coming up to one of the apartment complexes, he tripped on the curb and fell down.
The sergeant moves quickly to handcuff his suspect. As he does, a small knife lands in the grass.
And he kept telling me that, it just fell out of his pocket. He wasn't going to stab me or anything with it. And handcuffed him and put him in the car and took him to jail.
David Brankel is booked into the Knox County Jail. The BMW is inventoried by the Indiana State Police. In the trunk, they find suitcases filled with the tools of a successful bank robber on the move.
He told me who he was, the IBM bandit. And then he said, well, you call the Louisville Metro Police and Cincinnati Police. They'll know who I am. They'll want to talk to me.
Larry Duncan is busy working at his desk when the phone rings.
I received a call in the robbery office. Detective Duncan, I have a fella that you'll know down here. He says he's the IBM bandit. And I said, what's he look like? And he said, hey, Larry, this is your guy.
Sergeant Greg Winkler runs the list of evidence pulled from Brankel's car. Notes on banks in several states. Baseball caps and disguises seen in bank surveillance video. 9mm handgun and ammunition.
After we hung up the phone, I called Joe and says, y'all got to get down here, get a hold of CJ and get down here as quick as you can.
The three investigators rushed to Vincennes and their first meeting with the IBM bandit.
When I extended my hand to him to shake his hand, he moves forward toward me as if he was going to hug me. It kind of broke the ice for all of us because I realized at that moment we were going to talk, and we would probably be there for a long, long, long time.
David Brankel speaks to investigators for nearly 6 hours that first night. American Greed has obtained audio from that interrogation. Brankel begins with his first robbery.
The first one was a Union Federal Bank in Indianapolis, Indiana. I walked in and presented the teller with a note. She was very nervous and confused as to what to do.
He tells investigators about Donna's involvement in the robberies.
Donna got involved in this because she loves me. She drove or rode with me and acted as a secretary or listened to the scanner while I was inside. And if there was something on the scanner about me during that, she could key the phone and ring me once and then hang up, and I'd know that the whole thing was a bust and to take off.
He explains the motivation for his crimes, that he and his wife were becoming estranged. He believed he would lose his son.
I needed a home, I needed a place to live so that I could bring Michael back to me and try to fix this mess.
So the motivation for the robbery
was nothing more than to make my bills, pay the bills, pay rent.
David Brankel tells investigators everything. Brankel is charged in federal court with 43 counts of unarmed bank robbery. Facing more than 180 years in federal prison, Brankel cuts a deal and receives 21 years behind bars. Proceed to commit unarmed bank robbery and receives house arrest and 5 years probation for her crimes. David Brankel is also ordered to pay more than $175,000 in restitution for his crimes. Not a dime of that money makes its way back to Phil Sperry or Alan and Becky Logan, since David Brankel is not charged with any crimes relating to his dealings with them.
He had no remorse towards the Sperrys, and he claims that he did legitimate work for the Logans and that he didn't rip them off.
Now, David Brankel is a con man, but if that man had used his intelligence and all the good things about David to do good instead of using it to do bad and do evil, he could have accomplished great things in his life.
Shadows of the Self, The Chronicles of Deception. Prologue, The Art of the Mask. The mirror does not lie, but the man standing before it often does. In the flickering fluorescent light of a cramped restroom in a Stockton bus station, a man adjusted his tie. To the world, he was a ghost. To himself, he was a masterpiece in progress. He looked at the medical license in his handed duplicate, obtained with a simple, practiced lie over a telephone. It bore the name Dr. Gerald Barnes. It was a good name, a clean name, a name that smelled of sterile hallways, prestige, and the quiet authority of a man who held life and death in his hands. Behind him, in a different city and a different year, another man sat in a dark BMW, the engine idling like the purr of a predatory cat. He watched a grocery store entrance, not for food, but for the rhythmic flow of the bank branch nestled inside. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He was an entrepreneur whose primary product was audacity, This is the story of two men who decided that the lives they were born into were too small. One stole a soul, the other stole a fortune. Both left a trail of shattered trust that would take decades to mend. Part I, The White Coat Murderer. Chapter 1, The Clinic of Illusions. Orange County, California, 1979. The Pacific Southwest Medical Group was a beacon of modern health. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of rubbing alcohol and the hushed tones of reassurance. At the center of it all was Dr. Gerald Barnes, or the man the world knew as such. Rick D'Alessandro, a young and earnest physician's assistant, watched Dr. Barnes move through the halls. Barnes was a likable little guy, a phrase Rick often used to describe him. He had a quick wit, an easy smile, and a way of touching a patient's shoulder that made them feel like they were the only person in the world. "You're a natural, Gerald," Rick said one afternoon as they shared a lukewarm coffee in the break room. Barnes chuckled, his eyes twinkling behind scholarly spectacles. "Medicine is theater. Rick, if the patient believes they are being healed, half the battle is won. The rest is just chemistry." Rick didn't think much of the comment then. He was too busy learning. He admired the man's tireless energy. Barnes saw 30, sometimes 40 patients a day. He was the medical director, a pillar of the community. But beneath the lab coat, Gerald Barnbaum, a disgraced pharmacist from Chicago, was performing the role of his life. He wasn't practicing medicine, he was reciting it. He had spent years in community theater, and he knew how to project authority. He had memorized the jargon, the symptoms, and the scripts of healing. He had become the character so completely that he had forgotten the man who started the charade. Chapter 2, The December Shadow. The morning of December 26th was unusually cold. The holiday cheer was fading, replaced by the grim reality of returning to work. Among the patients waiting was John McKenzie, a 29-year-old man whose youth seemed to have been evaporated by a sudden, crushing fatigue. Rick D'Alessandro saw him first. John looked hollow. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken. He moved with the sluggishness of someone walking through deep water. "Dizzy, Rick. Just so thirsty," John whispered. "I drink and I drink, but my mouth feels like it's full of cotton." Rick noted the symptoms: excessive urination, dry mouth, loss of balance. He ushered John into the exam room where Dr. Barnes waited. Barnes performed the exam with his usual flair. He checked John's vitals, peered into his eyes, and nodded sagely. "Equilibrium issues. John, most likely a lingering inner ear infection or vertigo. I'm going to give you a prescription for an anti-vertigo drug. It'll clear the dizziness right up." "Is that all, Doc?" John asked, clutching his stomach. "I feel wrong. Just the holidays catching up with you." Barnes replied with a reassuring pat. "We'll run some routine blood tests, but go home. Rest. You'll be fine." John Mackenzie walked out of the clinic, clutching a piece of paper that was, in reality, a death warrant. The next day, the lab results hit Rick's desk. Dr. Barnes was off for the day. Rick opened the file, expecting to see minor imbalances. His heart stopped. 1200, Rick breathed, the words dying in his throat. A normal blood sugar level was around 100. John Mackenzie's blood was thick with sugar. He wasn't suffering from vertigo. He was in the throes of an acute diabetic crisis. His body was literally starving in the midst of plenty. Rick scrambled for the phone. He called John's house. No answer. He called the emergency contacts and ex-wife, a friend. No one had seen him. The panic began to rise in Rick's chest. A cold, oily sensation. Garden Grove Police. This is Rick D'Alessandro from the medical clinic. I need a welfare check on John Mackenzie. Immediately. It's a matter of life and death. When the officers kicked in the door of the small apartment, they found John in the kitchen. He was sprawled on the linoleum, his hands still curled around the prescription Barnes had written for dizziness. He had slipped into a coma and died alone, his body failing him because a doctor didn't know the difference between an earache and a metabolic collapse. Chapter 3, The Unraveling. The death of a 29-year-old from uncontrolled diabetes in a modern medical facility was more than a tragedy. It was an impossibility. Rick D'Alessandro couldn't sleep. The image of John Mackenzie's sallow face haunted his dreams. How could he miss it? Rick wondered. It was textbook. He began to look at Gerald Barnes differently. He noticed the way Barnes avoided technical discussions when pressed. He noticed the slight hesitation when asked about his residency. Driven by a grim curiosity, Rick called the medical board in Sacramento. I'd like to verify the credentials and identification for Dr. Gerald Barnes, he said, his voice trembling. Could you fax over his file, including the ID photo? The fax machine groaned to life, spitting out a grainy image. Rick leaned over the paper, his breath hitching. The man in the photo was Dr. Gerald Barnes, yes, but he was an orthopedic surgeon in Stockton. He was older. His features were entirely different. The man currently sitting in the director's office, signing charts and prescribing medication, was a ghost. He's a fraud, Rick whispered to the empty room. My God, he's a total fraud. On August 8th, 1980, the theater lights finally went dark. The police arrived at the clinic. Barnbaum didn't fight. He didn't scream. He simply looked at Rick with a weary, almost disappointed expression, as if an audience member had interrupted a soliloquy. The investigation revealed the truth. Gerald Barnbaum, a pharmacist who had lost his license in a Medicaid scam, had simply decided to promote himself. He had stolen the identity of a real doctor with a similar name and played the role for years. The trial was a circus of betrayal. Barnbaum pleaded guilty to manslaughter and practicing medicine without a license. He was sentenced to 3 years. To Jill, John Mackenzie's 4-year-old daughter, 3 years was nothing. Her father was gone. To the real Dr. Gerald Barnes in Stockton, his name had been dragged through the mud of a manslaughter charge he didn't commit. But the most terrifying thing about Gerald Barnbaum wasn't that he was a liar. It was that he believed he was a doctor. And once he tasted the power of the white coat, he would never truly take it off. Part 2, The Interstate Phantom. Chapter 4, The Entrepreneur of Bloomington. While Gerald Barnbaum was rotting in a cell, thinking of his next role, a man named David Brankel was reinventing the American dream in Bloomington, Indiana. David was a man of impeccable taste. He wore tailored suits that suggested old money and new ideas. He moved into a small office in a building owned by Phil and Bonnie Sperry, a well-regarded couple in the title business. It's about architecture and construction, Phil, David said, spreading blueprints across a mahogany desk. His company was called Acker. We're not just building structures, we're building legacies. David was smooth. He was cool. He had an answer for every question before it was even asked. He befriended Bonnie, sensing a vulnerability, a desire to be part of something grander. He proposed a joint venture, a high-end interior design firm called Trade Secrets. You have the eye, Bonnie. I have the infrastructure, he told her over lunch at the finest bistro in town. But David's infrastructure was a house of cards. He used the Sperry name as a skeleton key to open doors throughout Bloomington. He went to Sullivan's clothing store, a local institution. He ran up a $1,700 bill, paid it off instantly to build trust, then asked for a house account. Within weeks, he had walked away with $8,000 worth of designer clothing. When the bills came due, David was nowhere to be found. He was a nomad of the heartland. He moved his wife and young son to Vincennes, Indiana, presenting himself as a high-powered consultant for Vanguard Capital Marketing Group out of Chicago. We need a developer, said Alan Logan, owner of Logan's Wet Pets and more. He and his wife Becky wanted to build a family entertainment complex called Logan's Great Escape. When they met David, they thought he was an answer to their prayers. He had the brochures, the contracts, the timelines. He looked like success incarnate. I need a $3,500 retainer, David said, his voice steady, and $500 a month. I'm heading to Chicago for another project tomorrow, so I need to know ASAP. The Logans wrote the check. They didn't know that David Brankel's projects didn't involve blueprints. They involved interstates, fishing hats, and demand notes. Chapter 5, The IBM Bandit. David Brankel lived 3 lives. From Sunday to Wednesday, he was the devoted father and businessman in Vincennes. From Thursday to Saturday, he was in Bloomington with a girlfriend named Donna Hewins. And in the spaces between, he was the Interstate Bankmart Bandit. It started as a necessity, then became an addiction. David realized that banks inside grocery stores, bankmarts, were vulnerable. They were often staffed by young tellers, had fewer security guards, and were located conveniently near interstate on-ramps. His method was surgical. He wore a fishing hat or a boonie hat to obscure his face from overhead cameras. He wore tan coveralls. He never showed a gun, but his notes left no room for doubt. This is a hold-up. I have a gun. Be calm. Both drawers. Be quiet. Go home alive. His first hit was in Indianapolis, then Louisville, then Cincinnati. He moved like a shadow along the asphalt arteries of the Midwest. He was IBM Interstate Bankmart. Detective Larry Duncan in Louisville was the first to see the pattern. He looked at the maps, the timing, the proximity to the highways. The guy is using the interstates like a conveyor belt. Duncan told his task force. He's on the I-65 or the I-71 within 2 minutes. And he's 3 counties away before the silent alarm even clears the dispatch. Duncan started a game of chess with a ghost. He visualized the robber sitting at a computer, just like him, looking for the next target. I think the guy I'm looking for is doing the exact same thing I'm doing, Duncan mused. But David had an edge. He had Donna. Donna Hewins was a waitress at a topless bar in Bloomington when she met David. He was the successful businessman who tipped well and listened. One night, while watching a movie about a bank robber, David turned to her. "What would you think of me if I told you this is what I do for a living?" he asked. Donna looked at the man she loved, the man who promised her the world. "I would still love you," she whispered. And so, Bonnie joined Clyde. She began driving the getaway car, a black BMW that David had obtained through yet another series of frauds. She would sit in the parking lot, the engine humming, watching the grocery store doors. David would walk out, calm as a man who had just bought a gallon of milk, slide into the back seat, and they would disappear into the sunset of the Indiana plains. By late 2003, they had hit 43 banks. They had stolen $136,000. David was the most successful bank robber in the region, fueled by a deep-seated narcissism and a mother who, he claimed, always told him he couldn't even mow the lawn right. He was proving her wrong, one vault at a time. Chapter 6, The Crash. The ego of a con man is his greatest tool and his eventual undoing. On December 29, 2003, David was driving his black BMW on Highway 45 near Bloomington. He was in a hurry. He was always in a hurry. He whipped the car around a slower vehicle, nearly forcing it into oncoming traffic. Unfortunately for David, the driver of that vehicle was Bloomington Police Detective Kevin Hill. Hill flipped on his lights. David pulled over, his mind racing. He had a stolen plate on the car. He had the tools of his trade in the trunk. "Hands where I can see them," Hill shouted, approaching the window. David showed his left hand. His right hand stayed low, near the gear shift. "Bring that right hand up." Now, Hill drew his weapon. David looked at the detective. A strange, Calm smile crossed his face. "We're okay," he said softly. He slammed the car into drive and floored it. The chase reached speeds of 100 miles per hour. David drove like a man with nothing to lose, weaving through intersections, disregarding stop signs, leading a trail of terrified motorists in his wake. He managed to lose him in the dust, but he left behind the one thing a ghost can't afford to lose: his Indiana driver's license. The net was closing. A few days later, in Vincennes, Sergeant Greg Winkler and Trooper John Trotter spotted the BMW in a garage at 1919 Hickory Street. As they approached, David bolted. He ran through a maze of apartment complexes, the cold winter air burning his lungs. In the car he left behind was his young son, Michael, a final, chilling testament to his priorities. David tripped on a curb. He tumbled onto the frost-covered grass. As Sergeant Winkler moved in to cuff him, a small knife fell from David's pocket. It just fell out. David panted, the bravado finally draining from his face. "I wasn't going to use it. I'm the guy you want. I'm the IBM bandit." When the investigators from Louisville and Cincinnati arrived, they expected a monster. They found a man who wanted to shake their hands. He wanted to talk. He wanted an audience for his final performance. For 6 hours, David Brankel laid out his life of crime. He spoke of the 43 robberies, of Donna, of the thrill of the escape. He was sentenced to 21 years. Epilogue: the cost of the character. Gerald Barnbaum and David Brankel, 2 men, 2 masks. Barnbaum would go on to escape from prison transit, only to be caught again wearing a white coat and a stethoscope in a North Hollywood clinic. He couldn't stop. He would be 74 years old, still insisting he was a doctor, while the families of his victims like the Mackenzies lived with the permanent silence he had created. Brankel would sit in a federal cell, ordered to pay $175,000 in restitution money he would never have. The Logans, who lost their savings and their dream of the great escape, would never see a dime. In the end, the tragedy wasn't just the money stolen or the lives lost. It was the realization that for some, the truth is a cage, and a lie is the only place they feel free. The masks are now in evidence lockers, but the shadows they cast remain. The Architecture of Deception, a novel based on the shadows of American greed. Prologue: The Mask. In the grand theater of the American dream, identity is the most flexible currency. We are told we can be whoever we want to be, but for some, that promise is taken with a chilling literalness. To them, a name is just a label on a suit, and a life is a stage play where the audience never knows they're watching a performance until the curtain falls, and by then, the lead actor has already made off with the box office receipts. This is a story of to such actors. One wore a white coat and carried a stethoscope like a prop, healing none and haunting many. The other drove a black BMW along the veins of the Midwest, a ghost on the interstates who turned the mundane act of grocery shopping into a high-stakes heist. They never met, yet they shared the same DNA of deception. They built cathedrals of lies, brick by fraudulent brick, until the weight of the truth finally brought the ceilings crashing down. Part I, The White Coat Shadow. Chapter 1, The Perfect Performance. Orange County, California, 1979. The sun was a relentless, golden orb hanging over the Pacific Southwest Medical Group. Inside, the air was sterilized, smelling of isopropyl alcohol and the faint, metallic tang of blood. Rick D'Alessandro adjusted his clipboard, watching the man he knew as Dr. Gerald Barnes. To Rick, Barnes was a marvel. He was a likable little guy, witty, sharp, and possessed of a bedside manner that could suit the most neurotic patient. He moved through the halls with an effortless authority, his lab coat crisp, his glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of his nose. "You're doing great work, Rick," Barnes said, flashing a smile that seemed to radiate genuine warmth. Rick felt a surge of pride. Being a physician's assistant was grueling, but working under a director like Barnes made it feel like a calling. Barnes was the kind of man who had an answer for everything. He was a community fixture, a healer, a leader. But if Rick had looked closer, if he had searched for the medical journals or the deep, technical nuances that usually characterized a veteran doctor, he might have noticed the cracks. Behind the glasses, Gerald Barnbaum's eyes weren't looking at symptoms, they were gauging reactions. He wasn't practicing medicine, he was practicing theater. Barnbaum was a failed pharmacist from Chicago with a revoked license and a history of Medicaid scams. But in California, under the stolen name of a real surgeon from Stockton, he had found his greatest role yet. He had called the medical board, spun a tale of a lost license, and they had simply sent him a duplicate. No background check, no fingerprinting, just a piece of paper that transformed a con man into a god. He saw 40 patients a day. To him, they weren't people, they were script pages. And on the morning of December 26th, a man named John Mackenzie walked onto his stage. Chapter 2. The Cost of a Lie. John Mackenzie was 29 years old, but that morning he looked 60. His skin was the color of old parchment, drawn tight over his cheekbones. He stumbled as he entered the exam room, his breath coming in shallow, sweet-smelling rasps. "I'm just so thirsty, Doc," Mackenzie whispered, his voice cracking. "Dizzy. Can't keep my balance." Barnbaum, the man Mackenzie trusted with his life, barely looked up from the chart. He saw a man with vertigo. He didn't see the classic, screaming signs of ketoacidosis. He didn't see the fruity breath that any first-year medical student would have recognized as the body turning its own blood into acid. "It's an inner ear thing, John," Barnbaum said smoothly. He scribbled a prescription for an anti-vertigo drug. "Take these. Get some rest. We'll run some routine labs, but I wouldn't worry." Mackenzie nodded, clutching the slip of paper like a lifeline. He went home to his quiet kitchen, took the pills that would do nothing for the sugar ravaging his organs, and waited to feel better. The labs came back the next day. Barnbaum was off, enjoying the fruits of his six-figure fraud. Rick D'Alessandro was the one who pulled the chart. His heart stopped. 1,200, Rick whispered to the empty office. A normal blood sugar level was 100. John Mackenzie's blood was thick with glucose, a syrup that was systematically shutting down his brain. He wasn't suffering from vertigo. He was dying of an acute diabetic crisis. Rick scrambled. He called Mackenzie's house, no answer. He called the emergency contacts, the ex-wife, the friends no one had seen him. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Rick called the Garden Grove police. When they broke down the door, they found Mackenzie on the kitchen floor. He was cold. In his hand, he still clutched the prescription for dizziness the final, damning proof of a doctor who didn't know how to heal. Chapter 3, The Image in the Facts. The death of John Mackenzie should have been a tragedy of incompetence. But for Rick D'Alessandro, it felt like something darker. He couldn't shake the memory of Barnes's nonchalance. A doctor that experienced shouldn't have missed a blood sugar of 1,200. It was impossible. Rick went to the phone. He called the medical board in Sacramento. I need to verify the credentials of Dr. Gerald Barnes, he said. Can you fax over his ID and photo? The fax machine groaned to life, spitting out a grainy, black and white image. Rick watched the paper slide into the tray. He picked it up, expecting to see the likable little guy he worked with every day. The man in the photo was a stranger. The real Dr. Gerald Barnes was an orthopedic surgeon in Stockton, 400 miles away. The man standing in the clinic in Orange County was a ghost. My God, Rick breathed. He's a fraud. The investigation was swift, but the consequences were light. Barnbaum was arrested for manslaughter and practicing without a license. But in the legal system of the early 80s, identity theft was a novelty. He was sentenced to 3 years. He served 18 months. When he walked out of prison, he didn't feel remorse. He didn't think of John Mackenzie's 4-year-old daughter, Jill, who would grow up wondering why her father died from a common illness. Instead, Gerald Barnbaum looked at his reflection in a bus window. He smoothed his hair, straightened an imaginary tie, and prepared for his next audition. Chapter 4, The Never Was. By 1996, Barnbaum had perfected the cycle. He would get out of prison, steal the Barnes identity again, find a clinic with lazy HR practices, and start seeing patients. He even got married. Lisa Roberts thought she had found the perfect husband. He was romantic, successful, and carried the prestige of a medical director. He brought home 6 figures and spoke of their future children. I didn't know his name. She would later tell investigators, her voice hollow with the trauma of a stolen life. I didn't know his age. I didn't know who I was sharing my bed with. The irony was peak American tragedy. Barnbaum was so good at being a doctor that even the FBI hired him. He performed physicals on over 100 federal agents. The very people trained to spot deception sat on his exam table, let him listen to their hearts, and handed him their trust. But the past is a persistent hunter. Rick D'Alessandro, now years older, walked into a Christmas party and saw a familiar face. "Hi, Rick," the imposter said, as if they were old friends. "I'm not doing too well, Gerald," Rick replied, his voice low and dangerous, "because you're doing the same thing you did in the 70s. The curtain finally fell for good. Barnbaum was sentenced to over 12 years. The judge looked at the aging con man, who was now crying about his own health prostate cancer. Diabetes Dan saw the ultimate narcissist. "If I set you free," the judge said, "there is a 100% chance you would do this again." Barnbaum was a man who needed the coat to feel alive, even if the man inside it was hollow. Part 2, The Interstate Phantom. Chapter 5, The Businessman in Bloomington. While Barnbaum was playing God in California, another man was playing the entrepreneur in Bloomington, Indiana. David Brankel was a man of impeccable taste. He was smooth, dapper, and spoke with the confident cadence of a man who owned the room. He rented an office from Phil and Bonnie Sperry, claiming to run a firm called ACR Architecture, Construction, and Remodeling. He always had the right response, Phil Sperry recalled. He was cool. Brankel used the Sperry name like a skeleton key. He opened accounts, ran up bills at high-end clothing stores, and charmed the local business community. He even convinced Bonnie to start an interior design firm called Trade Secrets. But Brankel's true trade was a secret even from his own family. He lived a split-screen life. Sunday through Wednesday, he was the devoted husband and father in Vincennes, Indiana, living in a rented house, playing the role of the struggling but honest consultant. Thursday through Saturday, he disappeared into the safe zone of Bloomington. There, he wasn't David the father. He wasn't even David the architect. He was the Interstate Bankmart bandit. Chapter 6, The Rhythm of the Road. David Brankel sat in his black BMW, the engine idling near a major grocery store in Louisville. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He wore a fishing hat-a-boonie hat and a fake mustache. Simple. Effective. He didn't hit the big, marble-pillared banks in the city centers. Those had too much security, too many eyes. He hit the bank marts, the small branches tucked inside grocery stores. People were distracted there. They were thinking about milk and eggs, not armed robbery. He stepped out of the car, his heart hammered, but his hands were steady. This was his architecture. This was his construction. Inside the store, he approached the teller. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't need to. He handed over a note. It was clean, printed, and terrifying. "This is a hold-up. I have a gun. Be calm. Both drawers. Be quiet. Go home alive." The teller, eyes wide with a primal fear, emptied the drawers. Brankel took the cash $6,000 this time and walked out. He didn't run. He strolled. Outside, Donna Hewins waited in the driver's seat of the BMW. Donna was his Bonnie, a waitress he'd met at a topless bar. She had fallen for the smooth-talking businessman and slowly drifted into his dark orbit. "What would you think of me?" he had asked her once. "If I told you I rob banks for a living, I would still love you," she had whispered. The BMW merged onto the interstate. Brankel loved the interstates. I-65, I-70, I-75. They were the arteries of his empire. He could hit a bank in Louisville, Indiana, and be in Cincinnati for dinner. He was a ghost in the machine of the American highway system. Chapter 7, Operation Intercept. Detective Larry Duncan of the Louisville Metro Police wasn't a man who liked ghosts. He liked facts. He liked patterns. For months, he had been tracking the IBM bandit. He noticed the proximity to the interstates. He saw the fishing hats and the tan coveralls. He began to map the robberies like a weather system. "He's doing the same thing I'm doing," Duncan told his task force. "He's sitting at a computer, looking at maps, planning his next exit. I need to be at that exit before he is." Duncan coordinated 1,200 officers. He called it Operation Intercept. They placed undercover detectives as tellers. They waited. On September 6, 2003, the trap was set. Brankel hit a U.S. bank in Louisville. Operation Intercept. The radio crackled. The police surged. They flooded the interstates looking for a black BMW. But Brankel, possessing a sociopath's intuition for danger, sensed the shift in the air. He avoided the highways. He took the back roads, the winding rural routes where the sirens couldn't reach him. He slipped through the noose. Larry Duncan sat in his office, head in his hands. "We missed him," he whispered. "He's gone." Chapter 8, The Crash. Greed has a way of making the smartest men move too fast. In December 2003, Brankel was speeding through Bloomington. He had committed 43 robberies. He was a legend in his own mind. He was the most successful bank robber in history, or so he told Donna. He cut off a car on Highway 45. The driver of that car happened to be Detective Kevin Hill. Hill saw the black BMW weave into oncoming traffic. He saw the driver lose control and then regain it. He pulled him over. "Hands where I can see them," Hill shouted. Brankel hesitated. He looked at the officer. He looked at his young son, Michael, who was sitting in the passenger seat. In that moment, the two lives of David Brankel collided. He didn't surrender. He slammed the car into drive and took off. The pursuit reached 100 miles per hour. Brankel ran people off the road. He disregarded stop signs. He was a man possessed, trying to drive away from the truth. He eventually ditched the car in Vincennes, fleeing on foot, leaving his own child behind in the abandoned vehicle. He was caught a few blocks away, tripping over a curb in an apartment complex. As the handcuffs clicked shut, a small knife fell from his pocket. It just fell out. Brankel stammered, the smooth businessman finally replaced by a desperate, broken man. I wasn't going to stab you. Epilogue, the ruins. In the end, the two men were united by the debris they left behind. Gerald Barnbaum, the phony doctor, was ordered to serve decades in prison. He left behind a trail of medical malpractice, a dead young man, and a wife whose sense of reality was permanently shattered. David Brankel, the IBM bandit, left behind 43 traumatized tellers, a ruined family, and friends like the Logans and the Sperrys who had been fleeced of thousands. He was sentenced to 21 years. Neither man felt remorse. Barnbaum blamed the system. Brankel blamed his mother. They were the architects of their own destruction, having built their lives on the shifting sands of the next big con. And as the prison doors closed on both, the world they had fabricated vanished, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the names they had tried so hard to escape. The end. The Masks of Men, a novel based on true events. Prologue. The stage is set. The mirror does not lie, but the man staring into it can be the greatest architect of deception. In the flickering fluorescent light of a sterile clinic bathroom in Orange County, 1979, a man adjusted his stethoscope. It was a prop, though it felt as heavy and significant as a scepter. To the world, he was Dr. Gerald Barnes, a man of healing, a director of lives. In reality, he was Gerald Barnbaum, a pharmacist whose license had been stripped away in a Medicaid scandal in Chicago years prior. But Gerald didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as an artist who had finally found his career-defining role. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, on the asphalt arteries that connected the heartland of America, another man was checking his reflection in the rearview mirror of a black BMW. David Brankel didn't wear a white coat. He wore the suit of an entrepreneur, the smile of a visionary, and the hidden hunger of a wolf. Two men, two lives built on the shifting sands of stolen identities and broken promises. This is the story of how they fooled the world until the world finally decided to look closer. Part 1, The Cost of Healing. Chapter 1, The Perfect Doctor. The morning air in Garden Grove was thick with the scent of jasmine and car exhaust. Inside the Pacific Southwest Medical Group, the atmosphere was a precise blend of antiseptic and hope. Rick D'Alessandro, a young and ambitious physician's assistant, sat at his desk reviewing charts. He admired his boss. Dr. Gerald Barnes was everything a medical director should be. Charismatic, approachable, and possessed of a calm authority that put even the most neurotic patients at ease. "Good morning, Rick," the doctor said, leaning against the door frame. He was a likable little guy, as Rick often thought funny, entertaining, and always ready with a witty remark to lighten the heavy load of a busy clinic day. "Morning, Doc," "We've got a full house today," Rick replied, handing over a clipboard. "The more the merrier." Barnes smiled. It was a practiced smile, one that reached his eyes just long enough to be convincing. Barnbound, the man inside the barn's skin, loved the rhythm of the clinic. He loved the way people looked at him with reverence. In Chicago, he had been a pharmacist, a man behind a counter, a servant to the prescriptions written by real doctors. But here he was the source. He was the one who signed the orders. He was the star of the show. He had walked into the California Medical Board office months ago with a story of a lost license. He had used the name of a real surgeon from Stockton, a man named Gerald Barnes, whose credentials were impeccable. The board, drowning in paperwork and trusting in the sanctity of the profession, had issued him a duplicate license without a second thought. It was the easiest audition he had ever won. Chapter 2. The Case of John Mackenzie. On December 26, 1979, the holiday cheer had begun to sour into the grim reality of winter. John Mackenzie, only 29 years old, walked into the clinic. Or rather, he stumbled. He looked like a man who was evaporating from the inside out. His skin was sallow, hanging loose on his frame. His eyes were sunken, darting around with a frantic, thirsty energy. "Dr. Barnes, I don't feel right," Mackenzie whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "I'm thirsty all the time. I'm dizzy. I can't keep my balance." Barnbound looked at the young man. To a trained physician, the symptoms shouted a singular, terrifying diagnosis: diabetes mellitus. The excessive thirst, the urination, the rapid weight loss, it was a textbook case of a body failing to process sugar. But Barnbound wasn't a doctor. He was a man playing one. He looked at Mackenzie's vertigo and his complaints of dizziness. "It sounds like an inner ear issue, John," Barnbound said, his voice smooth and reassuring. He scribbled a name on a prescription pad. "Anti-vertigo medication. Take these. We'll run some routine blood work, but I'm sure you'll be back on your feet in no time." Mackenzie took the slip of paper, clutching it like a lifeline. He trusted the man in the white coat. Everyone did. The blood was drawn and sent to the lab. Barnbound went home that evening, satisfied with his performance. He didn't think twice about the young man who was currently a ticking time bomb of glucose. Chapter 3. The 1200. The next day was Dr. Barnes's day off. The clinic was quiet. The usual hum of activity dampened. Rick D'Alessandro was finishing up some paperwork when the courier from the lab arrived. Rick opened the file for John Mackenzie. He expected to see minor fluctuations, perhaps some anemia or a slight infection. His heart stopped. 1200, Rick whispered, the words catching in his throat. A normal blood sugar level was between 80 and 100. At 1,200, the blood becomes thick, like syrup. The organs begin to shut down. The brain begins to swell. It wasn't just a high reading, it was a death sentence in progress. "Where is he?" Rick shouted, turning to the receptionist. "Where is Mackenzie?" He went home yesterday. Rick, Dr. Barnes gave him some pills for dizziness. Pills? He needs a hospital. He needs N4. He's in an acute diabetic crisis. Rick grabbed the phone. He called Mackenzie's home. No answer. He called the emergency contact Tan ex-wife. She hadn't seen him. He called every number in the file, his hands shaking as he dialed. Silence! By the time the Garden Grove police broke down the door to Mackenzie's apartment, the tragedy had already played out. They found him in the kitchen, sprawled on the linoleum floor. In his cold hand was the prescription for anti-vertigo medication, the very thing that had sent him home to die instead of to the emergency room. He had collapsed into a coma and never woken up. He was 29. He left behind a 4-year-old dog